We're going to resume our session this morning, Honorable Senators. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Gary Kay, who is the President and Associate Professor of Neurology from Georgetown University, on behalf of the Cognitive Research Corporation. Good morning, Mr. Kay. And, of course, from the Ultra Sciences Clinical Research, Mr. Graham Wood, who is the Chief Research and Development Officer. Welcome, gentlemen. The floor is yours. You know the procedure. Each one of you is invited to make a presentation, and after that, of course, we will have an exchange and question around the table. Mr. Kay.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the committee for having the opportunity to present to you. I would consider myself to be a transportation psychologist. I've been working in modes of transportation, including aviation, which you were just discussing, for the past 30 years, involved in the program of returning pilots back to flight status after they have been treated for alcohol or drug abuse. We have an extensive program in the U.S. for doing that. But my background is that I'm president of Cognitive Research Corporation. That's a CRO, a contract research organization. These are companies that actually support the conduct, the planning, and the data transmission on pharmaceutical, nutraceutical, or device trials to the regulatory agencies that are responsible for approving and labeling of substances. Also associate professor of neurology, Georgetown, where I was the founder of the neuropsychology division. Been working in drug-impaired driving for more than 20 years. I had a lot to do with the original evaluation of a drug, an antihistamine that was non-sedating, and then finding out that common over-the-counter drugs that people don't even have a feeling of impairment could actually cause significant impairment, equal to a 0.07 blood alcohol, a drug you can commonly buy at the pharmacy or at the grocery store right now outside, and will cause a marked impairment of your driving. But I'm a consultant to the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, consultant to, as well, Federal Aviation Administration, and also the Federal Motor Carrier Administration as well. And I've consulted to the Department of Justice and Food and Drug Administration. In terms of the comment I prepared ahead of time, my top line, I don't have an easy button, unfortunately, and I don't have a quick story to tell effectively, and I don't have good news, perhaps, and I'm standing between you and lunch, all which doesn't sound very good. But the point is that our current state of knowledge regarding particularly impact of cannabis as one drug that you're dealing with in C46 is really insufficient for establishing an allowed threshold. I know that's not exactly what your role is threshold-wise, but or actually very important for me is informing the public, the potential user of what will now be a recreational substance, and informing law enforcement as to the relationship between the amount of exposure, the magnitude of the impairment, what is the nature and severity of the impairment caused, and duration, so that somebody can modify their behavior and take those things into consideration. I listed for you some of the established facts about cannabis, some of which are still controversial, some of which there are differences in opinion. And basically, we know that cannabis does increase risk of crash. We know that when combined with alcohol, that magnitude is even greater. We know that tolerance for cannabis does develop in different ways across different people. And we know that, sadly, that the active ingredient, delta-9 THC, abbreviated, is actually not a very good predictor of impairment, which would have been great if we had the same kind of situation we have for alcohol, but we do not. So we don't currently have a simple, accurate test for behavioral impairment. So we need to find ways that would actually, if we are going to be collecting a sample, ways to find out what would actually tell us about acute use as opposed to the fact that the drug is simply present. And perhaps a development of other methods for actually measuring the impairment as opposed to the presence of drug. And so solutions, I think, number one, if there's anything that C46 can do which aims in the direction of public information, helping people understand the impact that cannabis can have on their driving will be key. And developing anything that C46 can do to harmonize the way in which the samples are evaluated and collected, and the timing of those collection is so important. But my reason why I wanted to come to speak to you was the key thing, I think, is utilization of a standardized, validated study method to develop. We actually have methods for evaluating the impact of drugs on driving. I've brought with me and made available to you 2 documents. One is a document which is a standardized protocol for the developed for the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration that looks at drug-impaired driving across drugs, across substances, including both medication and illicit drugs. A standardized protocol. And that protocol was accepted and has been incorporated into the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's guidance, just published in 2018, for evaluating the impact of drugs on driving. And I can describe, if you're interested, more aspects of what is in that protocol. How do we approach any drug, including cannabis? We're currently involved in conducting a cannabis study under that protocol, demonstrating the validity, not just with cannabis, but also with a common anxiety drug, alprazolam. And so we can provide more information about that. But in terms of a bottom line, for my introductory comment, I'm recommending to the committee that you support research which applies scientific rigor and the kind of methodology which is common to studies that are required, submitted to regulatory agencies like your Health Canada for evaluating drug safety and efficacy. We need to study driving under the influence of cannabis using the same methodology and rigor applied to the study of pharmaceuticals. The U.S. National Highway Transportation Safety Administration has developed a protocol for use with medications and illicit drugs. As I said, that protocol has been incorporated into U.S. FDA guidance. And so finally, I'd say that in my view, we're talking about drugs. Regulations have been developed to address the safety of drugs. What if these regulations were to be applied to non-pharmaceutical cannabis, as cannabis becomes available as a non-pharmaceutical product? Well, clearly for these products, current information is insufficient for regulatory authority to approve. You couldn't make an approval or a label. Now, the label would indicate, do not drive for how long? If with this, this amount of cannabis, when is it safe for you to resume driving? When would you not be in violation of the law? And when would it be safe for you to resume driving? So without this information, I feel that the public, law enforcement, and legislators yourselves are being ill-informed. And I suggest that cannabis products require testing and labeling in the same way that we treat pharmaceuticals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kay. Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Dr. Kay. Thank you very much for inviting us to speak today, and also thank you for taking the time to really carefully examine this important issue of how to address driving while impaired, because obviously it is a big issue. Regardless of legalization of marijuana, we do feel like it is a big issue that definitely needs to be addressed. And the important thing we want to focus on today is really providing the data to make a good informed decision on what will be the cutoff level, how will be the best way to detect that someone is impaired when they're either operating a vehicle or, as we heard before, flying an airplane or piloting a boat. So what we're going to cover today in my brief introduction is just a little bit of background, what we do at Altascience Clinical Research, so you understand kind of where we're coming from at this. A little bit of summary of our proposal. I believe you should have the full proposal as well, and then briefly discuss kind of what the data we're proposing to collect, what will it do and what won't it do? Because obviously we have to, there are limitations. It's not going to answer everything. As Dr. Kay said, there is definitely no easy button for this. So a little bit of background on Altasciences. So we are a clinical pharmacology focused contract research organization. So the pharmaceutical companies come to us when they want to get a product on the market. And we do usually the first testing in humans. So first time a drug's ever given to humans, we start with it, and then we kind of follow it through with the drug companies conducting the testing for them. A huge part of what we do is really understanding the blood levels of the drug, how those blood levels affect the benefit of the drug, as well as how they affect the adverse effects. So obviously with cannabis and these other drugs, the adverse effects we're talking about today are how they affect cognition, how they affect the ability to drive. We're actually one of the world leaders in doing driving simulation studies. So we use driving simulators that were invented by Dr. K, as well as we use a cognitive testing platform that can capture the same platform that's used with the pilots within North America to test their cognition. We use those in the participants that we test the drugs in. So we get a really good picture of how they're actually driving on the simulator, plus their cognitive tests on the handheld devices. We've also been doing research into cannabinoids and cannabis for over 10 years now. We've run across our company, we have run 30 different studies with cannabinoids or cannabis. Our clinical facility in Montreal actually has run 16 of these studies, and so dosed well over 1,000 different participants with cannabis. We do actually have the facilities to test. We have specially designed smoking rooms so people can smoke it, and then it clears the air very quickly so our staff don't get affected. We also have the bioanalytical methods. There was discussions earlier about the roadside detection and sending off the toxicology labs. We have the methods to not only look at THC, which is obviously very important, but we have methods for about 4 other cannabinoids as well as the terpenes. So we can really look at a good profile of all the different psychoactive ingredients that are within cannabis. Focusing solely on THC, I think, is a bit of a problem because that's not the only ingredient that matters within cannabis. So just a brief summary of our plan. So the clinical program we've designed to measure the impairing effects of cannabis is really set up, I mean, as Dr. K said, to meet the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, this technique has been used for a good number of drugs to show how, a good example are like medication for insomnia. When you take it at 8 p.m., when you wake up in the morning and drive to work, will you still be impaired? This is exactly the tools that we propose to use to look at cannabis. So what are some things we'll be able to look at is, I mean, one of the clear ones is obviously the blood levels of THC, of cannabidiol, plus some of the other cannabinoids, their metabolites, because the metabolites of them are also very important, and look at what blood levels cause impairment. We'll also be able to look at the interaction of THC plus the other compounds. What's the interaction with alcohol? There's good research is showing that it is additive, so it does definitely make the impairment worse. There is some research showing it's actually synergistic, that instead of 1 + 1 = 2, it's actually 3 or 4. There's a really compounds the impairment. So it's really important to understand that. The other thing, too, which has been brought up today, is the tolerance. So if you're a chronic user of cannabis and you take a certain dose, and then someone else who's never used cannabis before takes the exact same dose, how is the difference in the cognitive effects? There's good research out there showing that there definitely is a difference. How much that clearly affects driving, though, is not really clear. The other things we want to look at is other components that are in. So cannabidiol is one of the other chief components in cannabis. Cannabidiol actually counteracts some of the effects of THC. So we need to look at that to understand, again, like I said before, it's not just the one component that matters, it's all of them together. How they interact to produce that impairment is really important. So the plan has 2 parts, each with 3 different clinical studies. So it's 6 clinical studies overall. If you look at a lot of some of the literature that's out there, the number of people exposed in each study has usually been 12 to 18. A lot of what we do when we do for pharmaceutical industry, it's usually 60 to 80 people are exposed per study. So obviously it gives us a much better data set and data to pull from. Also, usually for pharmaceuticals, we actually only have to do 1 or sometimes 2 studies on them. Because cannabis, 1, has so many different components and is such a complex nature, that's why we feel that these extra studies are needed to really grasp all these different aspects of the impaired driving for cannabis.
Can you try
To wrap it up? Yeah, I mean, I think
because my colleagues are anxious. I have a long list of questions.
Okay, I mean, that's I think a perfect place to stop, so thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, Mr. Wood, but I'm sure you will have an opportunity to add more. Monsieur le Sénateur Boisvenu, vice-président du comité suivi de Madame le Sénateur Dupuis.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Senator Boisvenu, Vice Chair of the Committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you for those explanations that we would like to have heard more about. I think this will really be at the very heart of the legal difficulties. And these are values that are not challengeable before the courts. And you, I think, both have come to the same conclusion, that the THC level cannot be the only factor to bring before the court saying that this person has committed a crime. So in Bill C46, the level has been established at 2 nanograms to 5 nanograms. So in your opinion, if the police use that data, do we not risk having a great many challenges before the court, scientific-based ones, saying that the person's not intoxicated because of what's been set out in C46?
Yes, you would be facing a great number of challenges. I think that what we can say with 2 or with 5 nanogram as a per se limit would be at that concentration, you could say that the person has consumed. You don't know how impaired they are. We can definitely tell you we do not know how impaired they are because you have found that level, and I think that in the courts that would create quite a problem. I can tell you that if you get up into 7 to 8 nanogram, then in fact you'd at least be able to say that with respect to some aspects of driving, you're comparable to a BAC of 0.05 to 0.08, which we do know is relevant for crashes, that we know the crash increase is there. But if you're down at 0.05, 0.02, I certainly couldn't tell you that when they are at that level that their driving would be impaired. So and it varies so much across individuals, as you heard, related to issues of tolerance and such. So I think the legal challenges will become very considerable. We'll have to have certainly, as you heard yesterday, I believe, about the DRE experts, that would be such a critical part of what you would need to actually gain any kind of conviction, I would assume.
Vos propositions reposent.
What you are saying relies a great deal on studies that have been done over the medium term. Within what time frame could we consider having sufficient scientific knowledge to be able to establish a THC level that cannot be challenged legally? So are we a year or 2 years away from that kind of a finding?
The studies that we were proposing, I mean, we could have them completed within 18 months. However, I mean, back to just having a THC level by itself that can't be contested, we don't know if we're ever going to be there. And one, we may have to start looking at like I said, the other components of cannabis, cannabidiol, plus the metabolites. But even there, when, like the tolerance issue, so at 1 THC level, we can determine exactly for a given person what THC level will cause impairment for them. But because of tolerance, it's not going to be the same for every single person. So it's going to be very hard to say this one level. I mean, back to your first question, the 2 nanograms is definitely very low. When you look at chronic users, there's been papers out there with chronic users 2 to 3 weeks after their last use will be above 2 nanograms. So it's very hard then to use that to say that, okay, the person was impaired because they were above 2. So the studies we're proposing are to get much better idea of what the level should be.
But in the meantime, if marijuana is legalized this fall, to avoid those kinds of legal challenges, this won't be a winner for us. If we fill up the courts with legal challenges, we won't be any further ahead. So what approach should we take? Or what direction should we give to police officers to manage impairment in such a way that you can bring this to court and it won't be challenged? Because if the 2 to 5 nanogram approach is going to result in challenges, what should we do?
Answering your question empirically would be to look, I would say we have 3 types of rules currently in the U.S. We have 0 tolerance, basically any level. We have the 2 to 5, actually you would find, like Nevada actually had the lower. You have the 5 in other places like Washington, and then in Colorado you have an odd one where it's 5 but with relative impairment. And I think looking at the experience in the court, what has been the experience of the courts in those jurisdictions shouldn't be that hard to find out. And I think that would probably be your best information to go by in terms of the least way to negatively impact your court system come this fall. So I don't have the answer, but I think that there's a solution to finding your answer.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Madame le sénateur Dupuis, suivi de Monsieur.
Thank you, Senator Dupuis, followed by Senator McIntyre. Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Kay. If I understand your last answer correctly, there is a whole grading, if you will, from 0 tolerance up to 5 nanograms, and the relative impairment that you referred to. So this is been an experiment for many states or several states over the last few years, if I understand correctly. So my question for you is, looking at your experience, and it's just a question for Mr. Wood as well, rather, you talked about some 30 lab tests that were carried out, or experiments that were carried out in Quebec. How can you compare the results that you have with drivers who had used some cannabis rather than alcohol or other drugs? What can you tell us about the results of the studies that you've already carried out? Because I understand that you're proposing a research program, but you're saying that you've already carried out some 30 studies in Quebec. And what do you already know from the studies that you've already carried out at this point?
So far have been only a small number of them have focused on the cognitive effects. So a lot of the research we do is focused on the safety aspect, as well as giving the information of how quickly you absorb the drug, how quickly you eliminate it, so you know how to do the treatments. In terms of the studies we've done that we have looked at cognition, it's only been a small number, so we don't have currently sufficient data to give the answer, which is why we would like to go beyond that and do actually on the driving simulators, be able to do the studies using those simulators to collect the data that we think is needed.
Parce que si je comprends bien, vous nous dites que
Because if I understand correctly, you're saying that there is a lack of scientific data. What I'm trying to understand is that how did other jurisdictions set out very specific numbers, but either 0 tolerance or 2 to 5 nanograms, and the concept of relative impairment? How did they come to those conclusions?
Of how they came to the 5 nanogram threshold. I know that that's been used by many of my colleagues in their research. I think that if you look at what occurs pharmacologically, if you smoke cannabis, you get rapid levels within the first 10 minutes, as you've heard, no doubt, and then over the course of an hour, that drops by 90%. To a lower level. So people are within that 1 to 10. So that would help us narrow down our answer as well, is that people know that by the time that they get to the point of testing and collecting a sample, that they're in that 1 to 10 range. I think the other thing is, in terms of a reliable detectable level, I think people were limited at one point to about 1. Now you're much lower than that. So I think part of it was based on laboratory science. Another part was based upon what did the samples show by the time people actually collected those samples. The sampling is so critically important as to when you obtain that sample.
Monsieur Wood, est-ce que vous voulez...
Mr. Wood, would you like to add something?
They based it off of. I mean, there's really good publications. One using a driving simulator at University of Iowa. It's probably the most realistic simulator there is. And in their publication, they said around 8.5 nanograms per ml is equal to 0.05 BAC, and I think it was around 12 nanograms is equal to 0.08. So I mean that, which is probably one of the best publications, because using an actual simulator and actually collecting blood, a lot of other, instead of collecting, they've given someone a dose of cannabis, either smoked it or ingested it, and then just assume that the dose, everyone's going to have the same blood levels. The thing is, that's not, what we've done with smoked cannabis, the difference is huge. We have people who can't inhale at all and don't really get any exposure, and then we have other people who, a few puffs, and they get a huge exposure. So it's been very hard to review the literature and really compare it. The best study there is out there suggests that it is quite a bit higher than the 2 and 5.
Even that best study, just to add, looked at 18 subjects, 18 people, and what they found, very small, what they found was an effect on weaving, but not even an effect on leaving the lane. So lane excursions was not affected.
Okay.
They found an effect on speed, but in fact the effect on speed was not that they were going faster, they were driving slower. And so they basically came away with one of their interpretations was that people with cannabis had an awareness of being high and were trying to compensate for that by slowing down. They knew their reaction times weren't as rapid, so they slowed down their driving.
Merci.
Sénateur, Monsieur le Sénateur.
Thank you. Senator McIntyre?
For enlightening us on the cutoff limits and on the issue of cognitive testing to detect impairment on the road. I have a very simple question. Currently, as we speak, between DREs, drug recognition experts, blood tests, and drug detection devices, which system of testing is the most efficient to measure road impairment?
Well, I would say that in terms of those three, I think that the DREs have definitely have probably some of the best data for showing impairment related to the drug. Some of their publications are rather impressive with respect to demonstrating sensitivity and specificity of what they're able to do. You need these things in concert. Presently, as Dr. Woods pointed out, we need to have some better measures of looking at the samples that we've collected to actually make an assessment that the person was impaired. So relating that level that we can find to impairment, and especially acute impairment, we don't have at this point. I think it's possible we will get there. I think that what we know right now is the person was exposed to the drug. We can't tell you when, and we can't tell you how much. But those things together, I think, are really important. I think that's the combination. And in the future, what we'd love to see would be, and I think that there's in California, they're working on this is actually funded by the state of California, is working on a tablet-based, more cognitive test. I mean, cannabis's big effects are on the brain and on thinking. And so is there a fairly simple test that a law officer could have with them that they could conduct and use as a test that would screen for impairment right now in an ability related to driving? That would be helpful.
Mr. Wood, you wish to comment further?
I concur. I think that the DREs are currently definitely the best method. I think it's important to have the blood levels as well. As we heard earlier, it's the totality of evidence. So you have the blood levels, you have the response to DRE. I think roadside cognitive testing, I think, is also definitely a very good way as well. Something that can be quickly just done right there and really get some measure of impairment, and then hopefully that's enough evidence that it can't be challenged.
Merci, Monsieur le Sénateur McIntyre. Monsieur le Sénateur Gold, suivi de Madame le Sénateur Batters.
Thank you, Chair. This is really fascinating. Thank you for being here. I just want to make sure I understand a few things, so a few points of clarification and then a question. The first clarification, or it's more of a comment, is that, as I understand it in Bill C46, the per se tests are not assuming impairment. I mean, it's a separate category of offenses. Since in the 20s, it's been an offense to drive while impaired by drugs, and we test it and prove it in certain ways. So this is an additional category of offense. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And the other point is that, regrettably, cannabis use and driving is a current and devastating problem in Canada and elsewhere. The statistics are hard to come by for reasons we've discussed in the committee, but it's a real problem on our roads, has been for a while. And it's not going to get better. It might get worse with legalization. We hope not, with education, but it's a real problem today. I want to understand the science a little bit better. You mentioned, as we've heard before, that certainly when you smoke cannabis, and maybe the times are different if you ingest it differently, it's in the blood quickly, but moves to the fatty tissue quite quickly, and then drops off dramatically. So when you talked earlier about the 2 or the 5 nanograms being too low for real impairment, as you would understand it, that's in the moment that you're trying to. But what about 2 hours after the fact? In other words, can you talk a little bit about what, from a scientific point of view, you would understand if somebody, let's use 5, if 2 hours after the driving incident, one is found with 5 nanograms in blood, what does that tell you about potential recency of consumption, or maybe nothing? I'm not trying to lead you. What does it tell us, what does it tell you about what it might have been like 2 hours before?
I mean, the problem is it almost tells you nothing because it depends on, there's huge person-to-person variability. There depends on how you took it. So if you smoke it, you'll go up to 100 nanograms within 5 minutes, and then you'll be back down below 10 nanograms 30, 40 minutes later.
Right, but if you're at 5 2 hours later, what might that tell you?
It could, but then so if you ingested it, your peak after ingestion can be up to 4 or 5 hours later. So if I test you, it's been 2 hours. And it's at 5, it could be because it's actually gone up, because you're still absorbing it from your GI tract. Versus someone who smoked it, it's purely just on the way down. And it's very, very different. Like for alcohol, one of the beauties is it's to back calculate, okay, it's been this many hours, it is very reliable. It's not perfect, but it's reliable. For THC, it's almost impossible to determine exactly when it was consumed, how much was consumed, and it's very, very difficult because it varies so much between people, between route of administration. It's just, I mean, it's one thing people are looking at is also the metabolites, because the longer it's been in your system, the higher the metabolites are. So if I just smoke, what's going to be mostly in my system is THC. And now after smoking, the 11-hydroxy, the other metabolites start coming up. So people have been trying to look at maybe the ratio of the act of the parents to the metabolites. Maybe that will give some better. It's an area of active research, but it hasn't a problem that has not been solved.
Chair, may I follow up with a question? We heard moving from blood to the kind of saliva tests that they're being piloted here, but I gather are used in industry. Mm-hmm. We heard testimony to the effect that vis-a-vis certain threshold levels in saliva do tell us something about recency of consumption, that there's a window within which one can safely say that if you hit, say, 15 nanograms or whatever the right number is in saliva, that tells one that there has been ingestion within a window of time in the relatively recent past. Can you comment on that? Is that accurate from a scientific point of view?
So I think if it's sufficiently high enough, then you probably can come to that conclusion. Down in the 5 range, no, because that's like
but
when
at 25, for example.
At 20, it would be very difficult to have 25 and not have consumed recently, unless you ate some, because like I said, when you eat it, absorption is really slow. Mm-hmm. So you could actually be on your way up. They pull you over, you're not impaired. They test you an hour later, you have it at 25, and then you're actually impaired then, and it can keep going up to 4 hours. But I do think probably around the 20 to 25 range is a very good indication that it was recent. Is it definitive? No.
Thank you.
Madame la Sénateur Barros, followed Monsieur le Sénateur Pat.
I keep wondering at this committee on these bills if I'm ever going to have a day when I'm not completely surprised by something that I hear from the witnesses, and I've just heard something else. I mean, the fact that with edibles, the impairment rate would rise over time is, there's lots of problems here. Mr. Wood, I would like to ask you this. or sorry, maybe this, I can't remember which of you, but one of you responded in response to my colleague, Senator Boisvenu, that the limit, oh, it was Mr. Kay, I believe, the limit of 2 to 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood will be difficult to prosecute in court. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and the science behind that particular.
Well, to the extent that the defense would challenge the meaning of the presence of 2 to 5 nanograms, saying that specifically by itself does not indicate impairment. In fact, they could say that my client smoked cannabis a month ago. There's data from the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the U.S. where they kept people on a unit. These were chronic users, and they kept them there for a month, and they were still finding pretty high levels of cannabis or THC when they were testing these folks. So I think that could be a challenge, and I think the only way to survive that challenge is to have great findings from the DRE, well documented, and the observations of the law enforcement officer who did the arrest about what they observed in the person's driving. That without that, I think you'd have a hard time. But again, I think looking at the experience of the courts, the prior question, I think is really important, and I can think of a document that I'd be happy to share with the committee that was across the United States looking at how they set these limits and perhaps has some of the court's experience, and I'd be happy to share that with the committee as well.
Yeah, that would be very helpful.
Absolutely.
To the clerk of the committee, Mr. Kay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go on.
Would appreciate that. That's okay. Thank you very much for coming. Very helpful.
Monsieur le sénateur Pratt, suivi de Madame le sénateur Jaffer.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
on Senator Gould's question, my understanding of how it will work is that when a driver is stopped, he or she will first have to pass a screening test, a saliva test on the roadside with a screening device, and the threshold on this, with this screening device will be 25 nanograms. And of course, that won't be used in court at all, but it will be used as a threshold for a further blood test if the driver doesn't pass that first screening test. You've just mentioned, Dr. Wood, that over 25 would indicate recent cannabis use. And would over 25 be a good indication of impairment?
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any research that had someone at 25 that wasn't impaired.
So would the combination of, because I think this is the government's point of view, that the combination of failing the first screening test, although not evidence at court, and then failing the test between 2 and 5 would be a good indication that the driver was impaired at the moment of driving.
Yeah, if that 25 test is reliable, then it is definitely an indication that it's most likely it was very recent. And then I guess to back up the blood test later, the problem is correlating that 25 with the blood test, and is very difficult. But I mean, now you have two pieces of evidence: one showing it looks like it was quite recent, another more definitive showing you the exact blood levels. And then, I mean, obviously with the observations of the police officer, I mean, it is a fairly robust evidence.
Now, just a clarification or maybe a little science lesson here. You mentioned a couple of times and in your presentation that there is research on a possible alternative ratio, which would be a ratio of THC to its metabolites. Would you please explain to us laymen and laywomen what metabolites are?
So when you ingest cannabis, the active ingredient that most people think about is THC. So then your liver actively breaks the THC down into 11-hydroxy, which is still an active component, and then further breaks it down into things that can be either eliminated in your urine or eliminated through your bile. So it's kind of the breakdown process of the drug THC, and how your body gets rid of it is through the metabolites.
And how would that make it a more reliable ratio than THC blood ratio?
Because it shows you it'll give you an idea of how recent it was, because obviously very recent is going to be almost all THC. As time goes on, you'll get more metabolites.
All right.
Also, as I said, some of the metabolites are active. So if you just focus on THC and not on other, which actually will get higher than THC levels eventually, if you just focus on this, but the metabolite's higher and it's active, you still have, so it gives a better totality of evidence.
All right, thank you very much for this. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Senator Batters, you had a supplementary on that very point, but quickly,
Yes,
of course.
it's very quick. Just with respect to the initial roadside screening, what we've been talking about here is an oral fluid screening. So won't that only detect presence and not any sort of level of impairment, correct? The oral
Well, I think the oral,
devices.
what I understand, I mean, what I've seen put out on the drug swipe, I think is one of the ones being tested. It'll have like a cutoff level that it will detect as presence within the saliva. I've seen the correlation of the saliva to the blood's not bad, but I mean, they definitely need to work on that.
Yeah.
But does that mean definitely impairment? No.
No. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Senator Jaffer, followed by Madam Senator Pate.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for both of you coming here. I have to admit to you that I was really looking forward to listening to you both, and you haven't disappointed me, except I think I'm more confused now. And, and you know, I have been a criminal lawyer in the past. I have represented people who have been said to have been impaired. If I was still a lawyer, I'd have a field day with this. There's no, I mean, you know this, but I'm just saying to myself now, there's no certainty here, right? And we are going to, I'm asking you a question, but also thinking aloud, that we are going to try and say somebody was impaired where, at least in the roadside testing, the alcohol testing, there is a semblance of a scientific, even those, as you know, have tremendous problems. But at least there's a semblance of some kind of surety, right? I mean, you know all the issues around that alcohol, and in BC, it's not even taken seriously anymore, the alcohol testing. And so the question I have for you is, we will have this bill, but what a task we are putting on the police services. How are they going to analyze, or how are they going to put forward when is a person impaired?
I think you are putting such a burden, you're going to so much a reliance upon your DREs. You have some of the best of those in BC. I've worked with one of your DREs there. I think that you're going to need tremendous numbers. I think their testimony, you were a criminal attorney, went to defense attorney, you would know that they are considered credible and they have got data to back themselves up. I think in the absence of other things that we've been talking about, you're going to be highly dependent upon your DREs at this time point.
My follow-up question is the uniformity. You know, yesterday we heard from the Toronto Transit, and their cut-off mandatory workplace testing fitness for duty policy, if I understood them, was 10 nanograms. And then this departs from other companies where it's lower. Mm-hmm. And then this bill talks about 2 nanograms and 5 milligrams per milliliter of blood set by regulation. Now, there's no uniformity as to what is impairment. And that's another challenge, right? That I'm sure that the lawyers will bring up in the courts is what I'm trying to say. I think we know is 0.08 for alcohol. We can take that. Am I correct?
For alcohol, 0.08?
Yeah, is a given. Mm-hmm. But when I look at this and study this, I don't have a so-called given, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm not reading it correct, Maybe the two of you can correct.
Well, I can say about alcohol, where the kind of been very involved with that. Richard Compton, head of NHTSA, did a lot of the very key research on establishing what our levels are. We came down in the U.S. from 0.10 or even higher to 0.10, now down to 0.08. I think NHTSA would love to see it go to 0.05 because legitimately, based on epidemiological, very strong evidence, you could show that's where you start increasing crash risk, is at that 0.05 mark. Some countries in Europe have gone to that 0.05, and I understand there's some sensitivity for that, sympathy rather, for that point in Canada as well, of thinking about 0.05. But that is based on solid evidence of where crash risk occurs. Now, on an individual basis, there are people who could perform just fine at a 0.05, but we take it based upon we can't test every individual out there. This is a level at which we can say crash risk is increased. And when I'm studying drugs for the Food and Drug Administration, some of the studies which we've actually done with Alta Sciences, studying of various sleep medications, of antidepressants, what the FDA wants to know from us is what percentage of people are actually performing worse than a 0.05. Now, if it might be that 80% we're below, but they really want to know, gee, what is the frequency with which people are over a 0.05? That will be basis for them with respect to the safety of this drug and with informing potential users of the medication and also prescribers about how long should they notify their patient to wait or whether they should or should not drive when taking this drug. Very important information.
Yes, and then the added challenge is if somebody has taken other prescription drugs.
Yep.
Then, where is the impairment? If I'm on a prescription drug and then, and so that's the other added challenge to assess this, isn't it? Am I correct?
You're absolutely correct. Just very briefly, what I felt that the driver, what your public, Canadian public, needs to know about the substance is, what is the crash likelihood? Am I really at risk if I do this of having a crash? They need to know, what are the legal consequences if I do this? They need to know, will they feel impaired? Because a lot of the drugs I study, people don't feel impaired. They think they're perfectly fine to drive. One of the last questions we ask before they get in the simulator is, do you feel safe to drive right now? And often they'll say, oh yeah, I'm fine, and they'll crash in 7 minutes later. So that's a big issue. They also need to know, how long after I use the drug before I can resume driving, I'm safe to drive. And the next question is exactly, Senator Jaffer, what you said, which is this question about, what about if I've taken other drugs? What will the impact be? What impact other factors would have? And these are important, like my experience of taking the drug, my experience in driving. If I'm a new driver, there may be different effects. What about my age? There are differences with some drugs with respect to age. There's differences with respect to people's weight. There's differences with respect to gender. Males and females metabolize drugs sometimes differently. And lastly, other health problems. If I have other health problems, might that impact how cannabis is going to affect me? This is what the Canadian public needs to know before they get in the car and drive after using the substance.
Can you tell them?
No.
Thank you.
Madam Senator Pate.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you both for coming. My head is swimming a bit. I had a whole bunch of questions, but in the end, if you were in our seats, what recommendations would you be giving to the government with respect to this legislation?
You want to start first?
I think that it's clear, we've heard from many different people that definitely there needs to be more research done and collect evidence. Does that help with this particular legislation? It will eventually, once we've had time to collect the data. But as of now, to say we can set a per se limit, I think it's very difficult. And like I said, it'd be very easy to challenge it. Once there's more data and there's more DREs, maybe those roadside cognitive testing, it will become much easier to enforce it, but it will be difficult as of right now.
But that would be the same whether we started today or we start 6 months or in a year, correct?
Well, I think there's been no large studies to really the study we keep referring to was only 18 people who were, I believe, all chronic users. There have been no big studies to really look at this and to really understand. I mean, we do a routine. When new drugs are coming to the market that may affect it, we do these studies to make sure that we can understand a lot of what Dr. K was talking about, like how long before you drive. We do that for drugs or pharmaceuticals. We can do that for here as well, but yeah, it will take time, and it will definitely, are we going to end up with it? It's a very easy as alcohol, that this is, no, it's probably going to be a tiered approach where there's different things that add to the evidence, but it is possible to definitely get more data to really help in that decision.
On a second round, very quickly, 1 minute, Senator Boisvenu, followed by Senator Gold.
Écoutez, je suis un peu comme la sénatrice.
Look, I'm a bit like Senator Pate. This information really speaks to us because we're faced with a legalization that risks going off course, legally speaking, and also to result in there being victims. That's what we have to think about the most, because we're legalizing something that's not controllable. Now, what I hear in your presentation is that, A, there's no equivalence between THC and 0.08 with alcohol. These are too ambivalent. This bill was drafted for people who smoke and not those who eat this stuff. And thirdly, the safest approach, as Mr. Gay was saying, is that when you're driving a car, it should be zero tolerance, so long as we don't have scientific proof to really be able to oversee that, whether people are smoking or eating.
Said I totally agree with. That we really are kind of ahead of the science. I mean, Senator Pate, I would say that, we do have a lot of research that's been done. It didn't take overnight that we understood alcohol and the messaging for alcohol for people. It took years to develop. We're not there with all other drugs. It took the National Traffic Safety Board to actually come forward and give recommendations, as we heard from your equivalent of NTSB here today, to say to the different modes, people need to be informed about other drugs. They need to know what drugs are safe, which are impairing, and this is critical. And the C46 doesn't just deal with cannabis. It deals with drug-impaired driving. And for drug-impaired driving, we're talking about even over-the-counter things which impair people. We need to inform people. We need to put proper labeling. One of the things when we had the NTSB meetings, which are also available, I can provide from 2001, and those recommendations basically said we need to give better labeling on products, whether they're over-the-counter or prescription, or in this case, a recreational product. If you go into a High Times, cannabis store in Toronto in a few months and buy your cannabis cigarette, is it going to tell you do know what you're getting? Do you know what the concentration is? Do you know when it's safe for you to resume driving? If you are a responsible citizen of Canada, will you know when it's safe for you to get back in your car and drive? And I'd say we don't know.
Senator Gold to conclude.
Okay, without repeating, which I'm about to do, the point that the per se offenses are not surrogates for impairment. They're additional offenses for impairment to send a strong message to Canadians that you're at risk if you smoke and drive. From a public policy point of view, our concern, of course, is, as Senator Boisvenu said, not to create victims, but it's the public health and safety of Canadians, especially those who are either driving or find themselves in an environment where somebody is driving having consumed cannabis. People have been consuming cannabis and driving, wrongly believing they're driving just fine for decades and decades in this country. It's a real social problem. So from a policy point of view, what is the best response? And this is our responsibility as legislators to deal with this current problem. You mentioned research, couldn't agree more. I'm a former academic. Bravo. Education re-risks and education, absolutely, and the science isn't fully there yet, but it's there enough. We know this from our Drug and Driving Committee, that cannabis use impairs those cognitive abilities relevant to driving. So would it not be a responsible legislative response at this moment in time, faced with the carnage on our roads, to send a strong signal to Canadians with per se tests and all of that, that it's not safe to smoke or eat, consume, and drive. There will be challenges to be sure, but from a public policy point of view, I'd like your opinion on that, some summary of how I see things.
I'll just respond very quickly and then pass it to Dr. Wood, but I'd say that absolutely, per se basically is prophylactic. It basically, people know that wow, one of the risks is not just crashing, and they may think I'm a great driver when I've smoked cannabis, but in fact, whoa, if I don't want the legal liability of getting caught, and if you set a low limit, a low point, a 2 or a 5 or even 1, then in fact you're saying to people, I don't really care how impaired you are, we don't want you driving and using cannabis, or you're going to have to wait a good long time. Now, that's unfair to frequent users, because as you've heard, their levels are going to be at that level when they haven't acutely been using the drug.
It's always Uber.
Yeah, I would say that's a really good label. I was thinking about earlier today, for this cannabis product in the store that you just bought, would just say, use Uber, okay? That would be fine. You don't want them to drive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kay. Anything to add?
I agree that I think having the per se law or cutoffs do make sense if the cutoffs chosen have some good science backing them, and then it is great for the public if they can even, just like you can get your personal breathalyzer, if you can get your personal THC sampler to see when you're below that, that'd be great way to inform the public, and it definitely would help.
Yeah, just a moment to say to Senator Boisvenu that actually I do think that there would be some legitimate basis for using this higher per se level of 7 to 8, because that does relate to aspects of driving from driving studies that are worse than a 0.05, where we know that there's a crash risk. So I would say if I had to go to court and be defending this per se limit, I would say that's a defensible per se limit. I don't know if you want to agree with that one or not.
No,
okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you both, gentlemen. It was very helpful. I'm sure that you have given to each and every senator food for thought at this point in time. And thank you again to have accepted our invitation and contributed to our sitting this morning. Meeting is adjourned.